Dan O'Many here. I'm the managing director of Inkhouse West. Really, really excited for this panel today about comms around IPOs. I think we've seen a lot of change over the last 5 years with the economy going up, up, up nonstop until about mid 2022. And then a pretty serious IPO drought after that. And now we're all kind of wondering how 2024 is going to look like. So we're here to talk a little bit about what you can do to maximize your comms program when it comes to an IPO. And I'm really, really excited about the folks we've got here. So I'm going to jump into a handful of questions, but first I'm going to turn it over folks to introduce themselves. And let's start with Lynn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Boucher. I'm Vice President Corporate Communications at Kappa Group. And we IPO'd in June of 23. So we were one of the few who IPO'd last year.
And Jenna, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Jenna Kozal-King. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Marketing at Databricks, a data and AI company. And in the past, I've done the IPOs for Okta and Amplitude.
All right. Last but not least, Monica.
Right, Monica Gould. I'm with the Blue Shirt Group. We're an outsourced investor relations firm that's focused on technology companies. And we've managed about 300 IPOs over the last 10 years or so.
Wow. I'm really, really excited to have you three together. The first question I want to cover is, and I turn it to you first, Monica, but I want everybody to chime in if they have thoughts, is how dramatic of messaging have you seen shift in terms of like how to talk in terms of the current economic climate? So like before, it might have been much more about growth and profitability was, less of a priority. And now it's obviously more. Has it been a huge shift, or is it just really more that the balance has kind of swung a little bit more toward profitability? How would you say things have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the post-COVID era, 20 to 22, we saw this increase in very, very early stage growth companies coming to market with, no path to profitability whatsoever. That, all came around the SPAC structure. And since many of those SPACs unfortunately didn't survive, investor focus has definitely shifted much more to profitability. So, whether it's a newly public company, a private company, or an existing public company, the messaging very much shifted to what is the path to profitability? What's the path to improving margins? And any company that, has not been able to show that has been, not rewarded by the investment community. So that's very much been the shift. I think, early 2024, it looks like there is going to be a little bit more of a swing back towards the growth. So, still a balance of growth and profitability, having the path to profitability there, but definitely the companies that are growing at a higher rate will get the ultimate reward.
That's great. Lynn, I mean, you managed this in June 23 when the economic recovery didn't seem as likely as maybe it does now. So was that similar to how you feel about it based on what Monica said?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And while Kava is growing extremely quickly, we're also able to talk about restaurant level profitability, which is the engine of a company in this space. And so we had that core message of growth and a really clear path to profitability. And I think that's one of the reasons that we were rewarded so well and continue to be by the street. And we flipped profitable our first quarter as a public company. So that definitely helped support us. But I could not agree more that you need both of those messages to have a very successful IPO, and making it, even if you're not as close as we were, making it really clear how you end up there.
Jenna, I mean, you managed two IPOs sort of before the profitability became so important. Obviously, profitability has never not been important, but it was maybe just lower on the priority list. So, it obviously Databricks is not going public tomorrow, but as you think about that, like for future, like how do you think it's going to shift from like an Amplitude or Okta strategy? Is it a dramatic shift, or is it just kind of a adjustment?
Yeah, I think you really have to understand what investor sentiment is at the time that you're going public or want to go public. I think that's incredibly important in how you think about communicating your metrics to the market. I think that it's pretty clear that certainly during Okta and then Amplitude's IPOs, that kind of growth at all costs was okay. But I think you certainly saw as Okta, there was always a path to profitability at Okta. And we communicated that kind of long-term, and we're in regular communication with our investors around what that would look like. So, but I think that investor sentiment has changed, and the companies that are being and will be rewarded will be those who show both profitability and incredibly fast growth. And I think as the market evolves, we'll listen closely to what investors are thinking and make sure that we're kind of, ready to tell the right story that's going to put us out in kind of like best foot forward.
Yep. Okay, changing gears slightly, Jenna, a question for you. So hypothetically, if your CEO, like a lot of the folks watching this are, comms leaders at late stage tech companies, CEO comes to them and says, I think we're going to be going public in about a year. And if you believe them, what would you say would be the first few things to do to get your house in order?
Yeah, I think you have to understand kind of your industry and have a very clear position in your category, particularly for software and technology companies. It's really the moment to make sure that your category and how you fit within the industry is well known to reporters and is well reported on within the media. It's a great time to build your list and start thinking about who are the right media, who will help us tell the story, who already understands us, who knows us. It's the right time to start thinking about kind of long-term, what does the internal communications plan look like? Do we have kind of everything we need? Do we have all the customer stories? Do you start talking to your customers and figure out who are the right ones who will help tell the narrative you want to communicate to the market? It's a great chance to kind of get your last big stats out there, your big financial moments and your big stats before, obviously, once you kind of flip the S1, you're in a quiet period. So it's just great time to make sure that the narrative that you want to tell about the company is out there. And during that time, I do a lot of prep with the CEO. I do a lot of prep, kind of, off the records with media. I also put our CEO in front of media doing off the records, just making sure they know that person and kind of where the company is headed and the big picture vision.
Yeah. And I know one thing, you've always stressed in our work together is the S1 eventually comes and there's no messaging around it. It is what it is. So the more nuance that those reporters have on why those numbers look the way they do, especially the numbers that might not be as good as the others, can be really, really valuable for when they report on you. So no, that's helpful. Monica, what do you think in terms of that more from the IR side?
Sure. So the earlier, one can start, the better. The cutoff point for investor relations activities is when a banking syndicate is chosen. So prior to the selection of the syndicate, the company is free to attend conferences, speak to sell-side analysts, and they should do as much of that as possible. So we would build a target list of relevant analysts that cover the peers that we want to be most closely associated with, start introducing the management team to those analysts. As part of that, solicit invites to conferences, spend time on non-deal roadshows. The key thing there being that the marquee investors that we would want to participate in an offering would want to meet with a company 4 or 5 times, maybe as a private company before the IPO roadshow. The IPO roadshow as a first meeting would already be too late for them to participate. So these are companies like a Fidelity, a Wellington, a T. Rowe Price, etc. So starting as early as possible and getting those engagements, engaging with those sell-side analysts will help the company also select the co-managers that they would want to participate in the offering. Because that, while you're picking your lead banks for, the brand name recognition, the strength of their banking team, you're picking your co-managers for the research and the aftermarket support in terms of conferences and marketing activities and the like. So that's really the best opportunity to kind of get a sense for, who really engages with the story, who do we have buy-in and who do we think would be a good supporter of the company going forward.
That's really helpful. Conversely, Lynn, if you don't have a year, like you didn't, but you're coming in and you want to maximize a moment like this, I guess the question goes from, what are the steps you take to how do you just triage and make sure you're working on the most impactful and important stuff if you have, say, like a compressed 2 to 3 month timeline. Yours might have even been shorter than that. But, and Jen, I want to hear from your thoughts too, especially with Amplitude, because I think that's some folks will find themselves in that situation, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was much shorter than that. I joined post S1. So
Right.
brand new to the company post S1. So we were in that quiet period. There was not really a lot that we could do. I will say two things, though. Our IR lead had done a wonderful job of everything that's been discussed. And just from an operating standpoint, the company had acted like a public company for a year before the offering. So that really prepared them to what's an analyst call going to look like? What's a quarterly earnings call going to look like? So they had a lot of that set up. I think the first thing I would do, I had it to do over again, and we did this at lightning speed, was a stakeholder mapping and audience mapping. So you have thought through, who do you need to talk to internally and externally? What matters to them? What messaging do you want to make sure you're underscoring with them and in a voice that resonates with them? And then executive prep is just absolutely vital, sooner rather than later. We had the luxury of a CEO who's just naturally really good at this. Many aren't. So the more you can do to create, what is that narrative? What's the elevator speech? And then give them an opportunity to practice in mock interviews and mock analyst calls. It's going to be far better, even if you have little time to do it. I would emphasize that.
That's great. And Jenna, you agree, or anything to add there?
My preference is to join a company at least 2 years before it IPOs, if you can work that at all. So highly recommend.
Mine too.
But I think if you are joining, for Amplitude, I think I was 3 months before the IPO, and I think a lot of things were not in place. I actually changed agencies. We brought on Inkhouse, and and hired a team. I think that hiring the right person really quickly. I was running all of corporate marketing there, so hiring the right. Actually hired someone from Inkhouse, so sorry about that, Dan, but she's incredible. Hiring the right team and getting your ship in, righted quickly was critical, and then also practicing. I think practice. We went out, quickly, and that was a great strategy for Amplitude, but it meant that we just had a lot more work to do in those 3 months. So yeah, I would say practice with the CEO is critical as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and just to jump on that, having the right partner, I don't even know how quickly we hired and onboarded Inkhouse. I do know it was an insane schedule, but no matter how much time you have, having the right partner, you will not be able to do this yourself, even with a really strong internal team. There is so much work going into it, and IPO day is crazy. And you need a really strong partner who can work with you, who's organized, who has all those media relationships, who's going to connect with your CEO and leadership team. So cannot emphasize enough bringing somebody in who has experience doing this, who's done it for another number of other companies and can really help and support.
That's great. Thanks both. Monica, question for you, changing gears a little bit here. Can you, most of the folks watching this, I think, are on the traditional comm side. So IR might be new to them, in terms of investor relations, with institutional investors. So what is the role of IR in the IPO process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we work with the company in terms of their messaging and positioning to the investment community. That includes the sell-side analysts from, the bulge brackets to the boutique firms and the investors. So institutional investors, retail broker, etc. So everything, we oversee, and everything from the company messaging through the presentation, all the earnings documents. So we'll work with CEO, CFO, and the rest of the team, the marketing team, legal, etc., on all the earnings documents, the earnings deck, the script, the press release, any other kind of financial communication, whether it's customer related, trade issues or what have you. So we manage that entire process and really help the company just position themselves in the best way possible to the investment community.
That's great. So when Jen, I want to turn this to you. How do you think about messaging to like a financial analyst or reporter compared to, say like a broader business or technology reporter? Are there some similarities and some differences? How do you think about it?
Well, the financial press are writing for financial analysts, so they're going to be a lot more similar and look for messaging a lot closer to what the actual financial analysts are going to look for. Whereas I find that business, tech, kind of your other, consumer press are much more interested in the big story of the company, the big vision that you're trying to paint. A lot of and then I find that like a lot of the broadcast journalists will kind of cover both. They'll be both interested in the big trends that are happening around the world, but also kind of knowledgeable about, your finances. And so you'll want to make sure that your execs are prepped to kind of have both of those conversations and know which one to have at which time.
Monica, how about yourself? How do you feel about, messaging to those folks?
Yeah, so the sell-side analysts are definitely going to get a lot more in the weeds with respect to financial metrics, guidance, key KPIs, especially how the company looks relative to a large cap public peer, et cetera. So they'll definitely get a lot more in the weeds on that. Also strategy, competitive positioning. You can assume your first call with a sell-side analyst will be at least an hour to go through a lot of those, especially if it's somebody that's interested in potentially covering the company in the future.
Got it. In my experience as someone on the agency side, it seems like the group to really work with the most is the legal team in a lot of ways, because they can kind of make or break everything you want to do. It's easy for them to say no, and obviously, they're more risk averse than comms leads might be. So what is the best way to work with them in a way that's going to ensure that you are able to get as much done as you want? I want to ask all three of you, but I want to start with you, Jenna, just because I know you've had to do it, with Amplitude and Okta. And I also want to talk a little bit about how what might seem like a hard and fast rule could also just be the point of view of one, member of the legal team. So how do you go about, working with them to make sure you're getting things signed off on?
Yeah, first off, certainly your legal team is one of your most important friends and stakeholders throughout an IPO process. I think I rarely do anything without running it by both our IR team and our legal team. Following the letter of the law is, incredibly important to me. And I think is for any company that's going public, you have to follow the law. So that's number one, do that. I think where there is some gray area, right? And I think the question for me often is this a legal recommendation or is this a business recommendation? And I try and have those conversations open and often. There's a lot of precedent. There have been, decades of years of IPO. So there's a ton of precedents, but different companies have different appetite for risk. And you have to understand that. You have to understand your CEO's appetite for risk. And you have to have a clear, open communication with all those parties. So IR, CEO, and legal around kind of what the tolerance for risk is and where the line in the sand is. And so I try and have those conversations early and often so we're all on the same page, and then go from there, but certainly always follow the letter of the law.
That's great. Lynn, how about yourself?
Yes, to all of that. I also think when it comes to the legal team, it's incumbent on us to do a bit of push and a lot of partnership. So I had many, many conversations with internal and outside counsel, both of whom were very conservative, to understand if we can't do this, what can we do? If we can't say that, how can we make sure that this message gets out in a way that minimizes risk? And those conversations were really, really valuable, both in helping me understand where the limits were and also making sure our story got told in a very powerful way.
Yeah. One thought before I hand it to Monica. Yeah, I also liked the approach of, if we're talking about it in the realm of risk, then just saying, all right, well, if we don't do this, then the risk is these stories come out either, generic or inaccurate or just a lot shorter and less nuanced than we would get if we actually, were able to do whatever it is we're talking about doing, like off the record meetings or what have you. So it's always important to say, well, this is what could happen if we don't do this. There is a risk to not doing that too. So, Monica, how about yourself in terms of partnering with the legal team? Is that something you spend a lot of time on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our advice is to partner with them early and often. We've worked with a range of legal teams, from those that like to be really in the weeds and involved in every single meeting, from the first, story idea to all the way through the final document, to those that just like to get sign off at the end. So one, we want to understand, what their style is, so we know when to involve them and how to partner with them effectively. And then second is, we always try to anticipate what legal edits would be like. So when we're writing a script, when we're writing a press release, we're writing it with the legal team's comments in the back of our heads. So we try to anticipate those and limit the number of edits and changes, in the final phases of the documents.
That's great. So once the S1 is out and you're into sort of a more intense quiet period, or you're under more scrutiny, let's say, how do you go about, obviously you need to partner with your legal team, every company is different, but Jenna, like, how do you think about what you can and can't do in that time? And like what's off limits, what's a gray area, what's totally fine?
Yeah, well, first I would say it's a little bit different if it's a direct listing or a, kind of a more traditional IPO. And so make sure you understand the rules and regulations for those, because they're a little bit different. But I think generally speaking, during that time, you should be doing normal course of business, right? The things that you've been doing all year long, your product announcements, your customer conferences. The S1 doesn't change the fact that you still need to do those to run and operate your business. And so you should still be doing media and conversations around that, but you should be doing it a lot more carefully than you used to, because what is not legal is to kind of prime or pump the stock in advance of your listing. So what you need to be careful of doing is sharing numbers and metrics and doing storytelling that's kind of greater or grander than what is in your S1. You're not supposed to be publicizing the S1, basically. So so I think about it is it a normal course of business product announcement that we have had planned for 6 months? Then you should continue to do that and publicize that. Is it sharing new numbers or new customer numbers or things like that? No, that's not acceptable during that time. I also do continue to do off the record conversations during that time. I'm very careful about it, and all of that, anything that you do during that time should be under an embargo, which would happen after. And so you have to have really trusted relationships with reporters during that time. But the purpose of those conversations should not be to, kind of promote or publicize the company. It should be to have the right conversations for after the listing day.
That's really helpful. Lynn, how about yourself on that one, in terms of like that? Because that was really your whole world before Kava went public.
That was the whole world. And we were even more challenged because communications function didn't exist until I joined. So joined post S1. So what is normal course of business? We just didn't have a lot. So a lot of conversations with our legal team about what we could and couldn't proactively do. And then those embargoed conversations with the right reporters were invaluable to us. We had to push a bit to get legal to agree with them, again, because we didn't have precedent for doing something like that. Vital to us because we hadn't been out there a lot publicly. We weren't a well-known company to many people. So there was a lot of work for people to do to get up and running, understand us, have the background of our business model, even our industry in some cases. So those conversations were really important and vital pre-IPO.
That's great. Lynn, custom question for you. One of my favorite stories from the Kava IPO was the Cramer Bowl, the Kava Bowl specifically made for Jim Cramer. Can you talk a little bit about how that was conceived and executed? Because obviously software technology companies probably can't do something like that for Cramer, but at the same time, it's such a good example of getting sort of creative with what you can do.
Yeah, I think creative and nimble, really important. So what happened in our case, we were one of the first, if not the first, to go out in 2023. And also, a consumer company that people could just understand. So we got a lot of people talking up the stock, media talking up the stock before we IPO'd, including Jim Cramer, who I think for a week or more in advance was talking about Kava. And one of the things that he said on air was, I like the stock. I don't like the food because I can't eat there because I'm allergic to garlic. At which point, one of our key messages is there's something for everyone at Kava. So, and this was, I don't know, Dan, 2 days pre-IPO that he
Yep.
said this. So I had to call our chef, who, by the way, is feeding everyone on the trading floor and everyone outside the exchange for an event, and tell him, I need a Kramer bowl. And standing, he's a chef, mind you, so there's some cursing that went on. I'm standing at a coffee shop across from Inkhouse's office. He calls me back. I'm in line, and he says, he doesn't say hello. He doesn't say anything else. He says, with some cursing, is he allergic to onions? Is he allergic to garlic? Because they're kind of the same thing. And he's in full chef freak out mode. End of the story is we got the Kramer bowl done. We were able to give it to him on air. He was so excited. He posted it on his socials. So it was one of those fun things we're able to do, but also sort of demonstrates, be ready for anything and be ready to take advantage of those opportunities as they come
Yep.
to you.
Absolutely.
By the way, his producer said, when I emailed him, said this is one of the funniest email exchanges.
I mean, I gotta send around to anyone that wants it. The post he posted on Twitter, I remember, about the Kramer Bowl. So it was a fun little moment. Yeah. Okay, my last question before I turn it over to like the audience Q&A is I think a lot of times with IPOs, it's so much excitement and lead up to that event that you can lose sight of like, well, where do you go from here? So, for all three of you, I'd love to hear, how do you think about maximizing an IPO in a way that also extends for like, truly the next 3 to 5 years of the company, right? Because we're talking about the company's next phase as a publicly traded company. So, Jenna, maybe I'll start with you there on how you think about, building something that goes beyond just, a big pop that day.
Yeah, the IPO is one day, and hopefully a long and storied history of your company. And it is a lot of work to get there, but it is really just the first day of the rest of your life. So I think immediately following the IPO, there's actually an incredible amount of work to be done, right? You're starting to prepare for your first earnings, which is only a few months away. And so you're starting to kind of put together all the materials, the decks, the talking points, the rude Q&As. In many cases, this may be your executive's first time doing public earnings calls. So, I think practice is the number one thing that I can recommend. Getting your board members to help prepare your team and ask really hard questions, preparing those rude Q&A that that investors are going to ask. I think there's just a ton of work to be done in those first three months. And so I encourage kind of people to take your day off the next day, but then you're kind of back to work, because there's a ton to be done to get ready for that for the rest of your life.
That's great. And Monica, how about you?
Yeah, so our advice would be to set conservative guidance, because ultimately the company gets measured by how they perform relative to the guidance they set at the time of the IPO. So many companies, especially in tech, especially ones that maybe not profitable yet, will set a long-term model. So it's balancing showing good growth and setting more achievable expectations, because the street is going to expect a newly public company to beat expectations and then raise guidance going forward. And not just the first quarter, will be for the first few quarters. And the first time a company misses, that's going to hurt, credibility. It's going to hurt confidence in the company, and it's going to take several quarters to gain that back of consistency. So really, dialing back as much as you can, showing good growth, but building in a good cushion into those early estimates is super key. So that, the best case scenario, you beat and raise, and then a year or two out after the IPO, you increase your long-term model because you're so far ahead of plan.
That's great. Lynn, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, from a pure PR comms perspective, you're going to get that halo, you're going to have some attention. And so how do you leverage that going forward, right? And so for us, because it was so new, we used that to, how do we take those relationships that we built as part of the IPO and maintain that interest, offer them our executives for other things, offer them thought leadership. And then one of the things we consciously and specifically did with Inkhouse is hire a firm that did both IPO communications and consumer PR. So how do you take that visibility and start to leverage it into the consumer front has been super valuable for us. Now people know our name. How do we make the most of that going forward?
That's great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to go through a few audience questions that I have. And by the way, for folks watching, the function to add a question is actually not working. So I have a few that have been passed to me. But if you have any, you can just email them to me and I'll check, just dan@inkhouse.com. But for right now, let me just pull up the questions I do have. Jenna, this was a question for you based on your answer. So how is can you talk a little bit more about how the process is different for a direct listing versus like going through like a NASDAQ and what that means for your role between Okta and Amplitude?
Yeah, I found the direct listing to be significantly harder than a traditional IPO. There are a lot more steps. There are things like an investor day video that you have to put out. We even did like an early investor day call. Our first investor day call was actually before our first earnings. And there's just a lot more work around communicating to investors that you have to do. Given that you don't necessarily have the full support of the banks to help you through that process. That's kind of one of the things that will happen in a traditional IPO. The way that you do press releases is often a little bit different. There are different milestones that you are kind of announcing to the world. And I would say the other thing I would say is it's a newer tool and way to go public. So it even is kind of evolving as people are using that method. So for example, we didn't have a single person who had ever actually done a direct listing. And so we really had to rely on our agency support, our kind of like agency teams, Blue Shirt Group, for example, helped us make sure we understood all the right milestones. And actually maybe Monica, you can speak to some of those. I'm sure you've done it before. I'll pass it to you.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so certainly, the biggest challenge for a direct listing is, not having a syndicate of analysts that are automatically going to be covering the company. So is it really that outreach effort is a lot more important, and getting the buy-in and getting that organic interest. Ultimately, the way the sell side works is, they get paid to cover companies through being part of a transaction at some point, whether it's an IPO or something in the future. So there's that dangling the carrot there. But that's really the biggest challenge for companies from an IR perspective, is getting that sell side coverage and interest, which will then, it's a hub and spoke system. So you get the sell side analyst interested, who will then drive investor traffic towards the company. And again, getting the company into conferences, scheduling non-deal roadshows, all to engage more with the investment community.
That's great. Another question we got was, how do you view the role of your PR agency in the IPO strategy and process? I'll ask you, Lynn, first.
Vital partner. I think really working in lockstep with your agency, leveraging their expertise and experience is incredibly important. And then also, having that, for me, Inkhouse was my team. It was a team of one. So that's constant communication, helping you develop messaging, helping you train your executives, bringing them up to speed to understand the story, I think, is incredibly important. And then the other thing I would advise is have that team meet your CEO and your CFO early, because that chemistry is going to be really important. There's a lot of trust that goes into you and your PR firm at this moment. So make sure that chemistry is there. And Brad, our CEO, immediately trusted Inkhouse. And with the compressed time frame we had, that made everything a lot easier. But your agency is 100% your team, whether or not you have an internal team. They become part of your team, and that's the way to be successful.
Excellent. Okay, next question. This is an interesting sort of tactical one. I'm glad someone asked it though. So if an executive is, was already scheduled to present at, let's say, like an industry conference, but it happens to fall after the S1, but it's about the company, right, and about its growth. Obviously there are probably some details that you would need to answer this, but would it be okay for them to still do that, or would it be a thing you'd kind of have to cancel on? And I want to turn over to Jenna to see if you have a thought there, because I know that, again, like there's probably some, details that would matter,
I think
but
there's some
having a little
nuance here
situation like that,
probably,
yeah.
but I think my initial instinct wouldn't be no. I think my initial instinct would be to say, what are we saying? What are we going to say? What can we say that's interesting? And how can we stay within the guidelines and the, and make sure we're not promoting or, gun jumping the stocks, right? So I think, if it was an industry conference where we were talking about our products and I felt really comfortable that our CEO would stay within the guidelines, the thing you have to be careful is like everyone wants to say something interesting, right? When you're on stage at a conference, and that's part of the reason to do it. You can't say a lot of interesting things during that time. And so you have to be really comfortable not saying anything interesting and focusing on the product, and kind of, and everything outside of, maybe customer stories, for example. So I'd say it could be done. It can be done. But I think it would have to be done very carefully. There would have to be a lot of prep work and a lot of conversations with legal and IR to make sure you're falling well within, what is legal.
That's great.
Again, this is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, of course,
But
yeah.
you should listen to your lawyers.
Right. Monica, question for you from the audience. Well, it wasn't tailored to you, but I believe you're the best suited to answer it. What do you do if the stock underperforms on listing day? What are the options in terms of messaging that outwardly? Is that something you just kind of have to own and sort of provide like a response, like, we're built for the long term, or what can you really do there?
That's a tough one. I mean, post-IPO, you're effectively in a 25-day post-effective quiet period. So there's not a lot that can be done. I mean, there could be, a range of reasons why the stock underperforms. It could be broader market. It could be something that a peer comes out with. So it really depends on the specific situation. If there is something, there is a range of possibilities where you can address specific things. Say, you're doing business in China and there's some new trade restriction or something to that effect. That could be something you can press release and address directly. If it's because a peer pre-announced or is getting acquired or something happened with a peer, that's probably something you can't respond to, but it's easily explainable. During having an outside IR firm is good from it. That perspective is that firm can take those investor questions that come in during that time period, and not have the company respond directly. So oftentimes it's more the retail investor base that's reacting to stock performance. Usually the sell side and the institutional investors are well aware of what is driving the stock.
Yeah.
I think an important audience on that is internal. It's really your employees who are going to be nervous and have lots of questions about that. And I think within the confines of an all hands, for example, that can be something that the CEO can and often will address. But I think preparing the CEO for what the options are, again, working with legal and IR to kind of figure out what is happening and the right talk track is important. But certainly that your employees are going to be one of your heart, because they are shareholders and stakeholders in the company. They're going to care a lot about that, and they'll probably be your one of your hardest audiences.
Right. Well, and like you said,
we had a full contingency plan. So what if something happens? What's the messaging? How do dev interviews go? And what Jenna said, really leaning into what do you say to employees and how? So having those mechanisms in place already, so there's not a scramble, was an important piece of work that we did.
That's
And
great.
I would just add to that, as part of the IPO process, having that conversation with employees about what is and what isn't acceptable once you file the S1 in terms of talking about the company to their friends, social media, etc. And so, once you do have those town hall meetings and so on, you have to keep in mind that those employees may talk outside of the firm about, whatever's discussed. So you have to be super careful about how you message that to employees as well.
Yeah, we're very prescriptive around what employees could and couldn't say about prior to and for the listing. We actually provided exactly, a range of tweets and posts that were acceptable, and you kind of had to choose from among them at both companies. And I think that worked pretty well. They were reviewed by our legal and outside counsel as well. And so I think just really being clear with employees exactly what they can and can't say makes there a lot fewer questions.
We did the same thing, and we also partnered with our HR team and did a series of trainings in the lead up to the IPO once we filed the S1 to educate them about what is material non-public information, how does this go, why can't you say anything, what are the risks to doing that. So they went into it really prepared and understanding not just what they could and couldn't do, but the why behind it. And I think that was incredibly important, especially in a business that's multi-unit, right? So we have 300 restaurants, restaurant leaders, area leaders who all really needed to understand.
Okay, last question, I believe, unless I get any more, is, and I hope that one of you has an answer to this. So, do any of you have stories of something that went wrong during the IPO process? Maybe the CEO divulged info they shouldn't have, a global event that disrupted things, some kind of mistake along the way. These can be generic, but Monica, you probably have the biggest view into this of anyone, but is there any examples of things that went sideways that we could all learn from?
Yes, so there were things that I've seen personally through clients I worked with, and then things we saw with other companies. The one big event we were working with a semiconductor company. They've since been acquired, but it was the night before the kickoff to the IPO roadshow. We were at I think it was Goldman's offices, and they did do business in China. I think they had a 30% customer in China at the time, and that was when the first China trade restrictions were announced. So we effectively had to put the IPO roadshow on hold. We had to go back to the drawing board, redo guidance, take that customer out of the expectations, out of the model, and then we came back about 3 months later. Having taken them out, and the company still felt even with that customer completely taken out, which was the worst case scenario, that they could still show good growth, good trend towards profitability, etc. The thing that we see most often, though, and that's hurt some companies more so than others, is getting the share count right. So you usually have an analyst day that's separate from a modeling session. Modeling session for the sell side community is much closer to the timing of the IPO, so that numbers are a little more final, guidance is a little more final. And the very last piece of that is getting the share count in there and share count expectations. And it might seem like a small thing, but it throws off the big important number, which is EPS. And so making sure that, going through the sell side models, making sure that their expectations are correct with the kind of guidance that was laid out in the IPO. Yes, you can talk to, before the IPO, before the roadshow kicks off, you can talk to analysts, you can give them feedback on their models, can't tell them where their things are wrong or their assumptions are out of line. So making sure that those things are all in place before the roadshow kicks off is, I would say, the number one.
That's wild. Yeah. And really helpful. Okay. Jenna, Lynn, Monica, anything you feel like I should have asked or anything you want to say about the topic before we wrap up?
It's a lot of fun. You should definitely do it.
Yeah, I
Highly
agree.
recommend
I
doing
agree.
it.
I hope 2024 will be a little busier for everybody's sake. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. Folks watching, we will have a recording posted online in the next few days for anybody that joined late or had to drop early. But again, just want to thank our panelists for taking the time. Your experience is invaluable, and let's hope 2024 is a little busier. Thanks, everyone. Bye.